Hello, everyone from Haaretz headquarters in Tel Aviv. I'm Amir Tibon. It's just past 8 p.m. here in Israel, 1 p.m. on the East Coast in the United States, and we are ready to begin another great discussion of a Zoom with Haaretz. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and I see more and more people are joining in. So welcome to everyone. Our discussion today is about the ties between Israel and the Democratic Party, and it's happening at a very dramatic moment, both in Israeli politics and in the US-Israel relationship. Over here in Israel, obviously the biggest story of the day and of the week is the attempt to form a new government here that will put an end to the 12 years of Benjamin Netanyahu's rule in Israel. And we'll speak about that as well today because we are a news organization. We're not going to ignore this kind of development. And at the same time, more broadly, in the US-Israel relationship and in the relationship between Israel and the American Jewish community, we have also gone through very dramatic events recently with the tensions around the war in Gaza, the criticism that Israel witnessed in Congress and from parts of the Jewish community, and that is the main issue we'll discuss today. And we are also going to try to see how the two issues meet each other, what a new government in Israel without Netanyahu, if it is indeed formed, can do about this crisis, how can the trust be rebuilt. We have a great panel here with us to discuss this. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Ben Samuels, our Washington correspondent, who has been covering this issue for a few good weeks now and really leading the coverage, bringing a lot of interesting stories and features about what is happening between Israel and the Democrats and the Jewish community. Ellison Kaplan-Sommer, who has been writing about these issues for more than 2 decades now and really extensive knowledge about Israel and the American Jewish community. And also we'll talk about politics because Ellison lives in Ra'anana, which is on regular days boring, quiet suburb of Tel Aviv, but maybe soon you will be getting a lot of extra security detail there because it's the hometown of Naftali Bennett, who is, destined to be the next prime minister. We'll see if that happens. And speaking of, again, both Israeli politics and the US-Israel relationship, we have a special guest with us today on the Zoom, Dani Dayan, former Israeli consul general in New York, and recently Haaretz columnist, writing more and more great, interesting articles for us at Haaretz. So if you want to read his writing, now is the time to subscribe. And Dani is also a member of a New Hope, Tikva Hadasha, one of the parties that is supposed to be a member of the new coalition, if it is indeed formed, that will replace Netanyahu. This is the party of Gideon Sa'ar, a right-wing ideological party, but one that opposes Netanyahu. And we'll discuss again, both the Israeli-American relationship and Israeli politics also with Dani. So we have a nice crowd and the people are joining more and more. I just want to say we are inviting everyone, all of the attendees, to send us questions via the chat button. You can write the questions via the chat and I will be able to see them. And towards the end of the hour, we're going to speak for just about an hour. Towards the end of it, I will refer some of your questions to our distinguished panel, so you'll also get answers from them. And now let's jump right in. Ben, I want to start with you. If you had to kind of summarize what we saw in recent weeks between Israel and the Democratic Party, looking at both the Biden administration and on Congress, what is the biggest storyline that is emerging in this relationship?
So I think the headline would be that the past few weeks have seen the most vocal support of Palestinian rights in the history of Congress. So whether or not that goes hand in hand with criticism of Israel, that remains to be seen and that's up for debate. But I don't think there's any doubt that there's sort of been a coalescing of a message surrounding the support of Palestinian rights. And a lot of that is coming from progressive lawmakers who are bringing their own personal context to this matter. But beyond that, it's also coming from other Democrats who haven't been traditionally outspoken toward Palestinian rights.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that we are seeing, there is this tension building up in Congress, but the Biden administration, Ellison, is not exactly there.
Yeah, Biden is still playing it old school, which is pretty much keeping any kind of criticism of Israeli policy behind closed doors for those closed conversations. And when we see the readouts, the transcripts of his conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu during the recent Gaza conflict. You have to read between the lines to see anything resembling Biden putting his foot down and telling Netanyahu that there has to be a ceasefire and it has to stop. And it's kind of a continuation of what we saw in his campaign strategy in the presidential race, in that he wants to keep the conflicts, the confrontations, the focus on his domestic agenda, and he doesn't want to create big headlines when it comes to foreign policy in general, and specifically in the case of Israel. So while if there was indeed some harsher language coming down from the White House than we've traditionally seen in Joe Biden, it was not making it into the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, or Haaretz, because it was happening quietly, and you sort of have to look at hints to see if the Biden administration has shifted very much. But there was a huge gap between the tone, the language, the attitude that we saw coming out of the White House in contrast to what we saw happening in Congress.
Yeah, and this actually, what Ellison just describes, connects nicely to a story that Ben and Jonathan Lees, our diplomatic correspondent, published just a few hours ago, saying that while there is concern in Israel about what's coming from Congress, Israeli officials are kind of assured by the support from the Biden administration. Great story that I encourage everyone who is interested in this subject to read on Haaretz.com, and really shows you the contrast over there. Danny, turning to you. You were in New York City when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was elected for her first term in Congress, and you saw this change that is happening in the Democratic Party taking place not just in New York, but really all over the map. Are you surprised by the developments that we saw in the relationship in the last 3 weeks around the Gaza war?
No, I'm not surprised. First of all, we must say we didn't witness at all a collapse in the friendship between Israel and the Democratic Party. Quite the contrary. I think that the behavior of the Biden administration, let's not forget, Joe Biden is a little bit more important than AOC. The attitude of the Biden administration, led by the president himself, towards Israel during the days of the conflict in Gaza were absolutely positive. President Biden said, he encapsulated, he described in a nutshell the entire Israeli-Palestinian peace process, past, present, and future, saying that as long as they don't recognize the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state, there will be no peace. And his attitude was extremely positive. Is the fact that ultimately he pressed for a ceasefire. I'm not sure that pressure for a ceasefire was not coordinated with Israel. So I am not minimizing, I am not underestimating at all the importance of the progressive wing, the left wing, the radical wing of the Democratic Party. I am painfully aware that it will have a strong influence in the future. I don't think that today we are at that moment. What worries me most about that phenomena that you just mentioned is not so much the squad and the newly arrived, newly elected members of this that are similar to the squad, like Jamal Bauman and others, that is also from New York. What worries me most is the influence of the progressive anti-Israeli electorate on mainstream Democrats. It didn't influence President Biden, but I saw that. I don't want to mention names, but I saw that in...
maybe other panelists will mention names.
In Senate races and House races, in the primaries. American politics, to a large extent, are today a politics of primaries elections, because there are districts that most districts are not swing districts. So the primary is the real election. And in that elections, in that cases, I could see very clearly mainstream Democrats that pay with Israeli currency in order to attract the progressive voter.
So Danny said, I don't want to mention names, but Ben, in your story today, you are mentioning two members of, well, a senator and a member of Congress who were considered very strong, and I think still are considered very strong supporters of Israel for many years throughout their career. And yet we did see strong criticism from them during this gather. Or Danny says this is political, it's about primaries. Where do you see this coming from?
So I don't necessarily see this as pressure from the progressive wing of the party. I see it more as Israel drifting further right, which in turn makes the center of gravity of the Democratic Party move further to the left. So, you know, when you see someone like Bob Menendez, who's considered probably the most pro-Israel senator in Senate, you know, he was one of 4 Democrats to be against the Iran deal. He was very vocal in his opposition to it during the Obama administration. When he criticizes Israel's actions in Gaza, that isn't because he's being afraid of being primaried. That's because the Israeli government is doing things that are arguably too much for even someone like Bob Menendez to rationalize that. And then the other member of Congress is Jerry Nadler, who represents probably, I think it's the biggest Jewish district in Congress. And, you know, he's been in Congress for about 30 years. And, you know, he's also one of those, you know, ardent pro-Israel stalwarts in Congress. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times the other day saying that, you know, the Democratic Party is what it is. It remains pro-2 states. It remains anti-BDS, but it is also anti-settlements, and it's anti-annexation, and it's anti-Jewish supremacy. So the further that Israel drifts in that direction, I think that is going to make things harder for Democrats who have been more traditionally pro-Israel going beyond the threat of primaries. That's not to say that primaries don't matter, though.
Danny, I'll let you respond in a minute because I see you have something to say.
Well, you know, I think that one of the problems Israel has in its relationship with the Democratic Party is that, you know, we expect Democrats to understand Israel, and that's legitimate, legit to ask them, even to demand them to understand Israel, but I'm not sure we make a serious effort to understand the Democratic Party of 2021. The Democratic Party of 2021 is not the Democratic Party of the 1980s or the 1990s. That was, you know, more or less, the Democratic Party was the party of fulfilling the American dream with a touch of social justice and some very limited LGBT rights. Now the Democratic Party is a completely different thing, and you cannot relate with the new Democrats, and I mean even the mainstream Democrats. For instance, the candidates for president in the primary, in the last primary, if you don't understand really at depth, for instance, the African American narrative of systemic discrimination, if you don't understand at depth the Latino narrative of immigration, and unfortunately, Israeli politicians, diplomats, I'm not sure they quite understand.
Danny, I want to ask you to try next time that you speak to get closer to the microphone, because there is some echo that is making it difficult. Or maybe if you have earphones that could kind of diffuse the echo, because you are saying interesting and important things about Israel's, you know, many Israeli officials who deal with this and yet don't see the need to actually understand the narratives of big constituencies in the United States that support the Democratic Party. Ellison, I want to turn over to you, and we are on the eve of this political drama here in Israel with the possibility of a new government. Do you think that moving Netanyahu to the, you know, either, you know, to the position of the leader of the opposition, or maybe out of politics, it remains to be seen.
Who knows where?
Who knows? We have no idea what will happen. Or he remains prime minister and we go to a 5th election, which is also an option in Israel. But assuming this scenario of a Netanyahu-less government is fulfilled, how do you think that would impact this issue, if at all?
Well, I was going to mention when we were talking about sort of, Danny mentioned the overall historical view. You can't ignore the fact that while the Democratic Party is consistently and steadily, because of demographic trends for many reasons, moving steadily towards the left, the Israeli electorate during the exact same years has been moving right. And I think that is why, you know, you're seeing a detachment of what has been a very close relationship between the roots, the grassroots in Israel and the U.S. So that's an overall trend. But specifically, when you look at Netanyahu and we look at what's happening in the Democratic Party, there is no way you can ignore the fact that, for more than, I would say, close to a decade, it's been very clear that Netanyahu has used partisanship, has used the animosity, the conflicts between Republicans and Democrats, and used the Republican Party in order to achieve his goals in Washington, and that has taken its toll on the Democratic side. It's been clear, there were accusations that he had held a fundraiser as far back as Mitt Romney's campaign, and it all reached its crescendo in the Donald Trump years, where Donald Trump always says the quiet part out loud in terms of being a Republican means loving Israel and supporting Israel, and being a Democrat means being anti-Israel. And the flip side worked because of this close relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. People who really saw Trump as standing for everything that they opposed in the Democratic Party, consciously or unconsciously, turned Netanyahu into a Trump extension, and therefore started feeling as much animosity towards him as they did towards Trump. Now, in a post-Netanyahu era, it's going to be very interesting to see if this dynamic continues, or if the elimination of Netanyahu from the picture is going to ease the alienation within the Democratic Party. I have a suspicion that once they get to know Naftali Bennett, it's not going to be such a great love story between the Democratic Party and Naftali Bennett either.
So Danny, I want to take this question to you as well. The party you're a member of is supposed to be an important member of this coalition in the making, and yet it is a right-wing party that supports settlements, that wants Israel, if not to immediately go for annexation, then at least have that objective. So how does a government led by Naftali Bennett and with the participation of Gideon Saar work to improve the relationship here?
Well, first of all, I hate the word right wing. I never call myself right wing. I consider myself as my mentor, Menachem Begin, that never used that word. Used to say we are a national liberal movement. I don't know if you can call, for instance, the party that advocates for gay marriage, for marriage equality in Israel, a right-wing party. So I prefer the term national liberal. I think it's much more, describes much better, for sure myself, but I believe that also our party. That being said, yes, it will be challenging, but I think that the new government, if it's formed with Naftali Bennett and Gideon Saar and Yair Lapid as foreign minister, alternate prime minister, will come to Washington without that extra weight, that overweight that Netanyahu has on his shoulder, as not only as a conservative, but as almost a card-carrying GOP member. To some extent, I served in the US simultaneously with my colleague Ron Dermer. He was in Washington, I was in New York. I would say that I looked at our mission in Washington, and I didn't like what I saw, what I see. I saw there a diplomatic mission that was almost entirely focused on conservatives, Republicans, evangelicals, and certain type of Jews only, while I did try to make in New York exactly the opposite, bipartisan, and even since that was the situation in Washington, I was in New York, and in 5 states that are overwhelmingly Democratic, I made, I would say, affirmative action, positive discrimination, to the Democrats and to liberals and to minorities and to liberal Jews. I think that this government, if it's formed, it's a big if yet, if it's formed, will adopt exactly that attitude. It will cease to see those that have discrepancies with Israel policy enemies of Israel. And I think that this government will expand the scope of those that it will maintain a serious, a genuine, candid dialogue with. And that obviously includes the administration. I am sure that the government, if it's formed, will not, for instance, have a confrontational attitude towards the Biden administration in the Iranian file, but will strive for a discreet dialogue, even if there are serious differences of opinion.
Yeah. So, and I will ask you soon, Danny, about Ron Dermer, who you mentioned, but first I want to go to Ben. Ben, you've written a lot about the tensions within the Democratic Party and the rising progressive wing and its criticism of Israel, an unprecedented event. And you've also written about a group that is, well, I don't know in terms of larger or smaller, but certainly not as vocal in the party, that is trying to push back on these changes and maybe also has some electoral concerns about where this could lead to. Can you describe a bit the dynamic, this power struggle within the party over the Israel narrative?
Sure. So I think the best way it can be described is honestly as like a silent majority almost. So, during the flare up in Gaza, there was a special order hour, it's called, at the House where, there are 15 progressives and I think it was 12 pro-Israel Democrats, very much AIPAC party line, very much having a vocal debate about whether or not Israel was in the right or the wrong. And it went beyond just the events in Gaza, but it focused much more on Israel's traditional role with the Palestinians, the occupation, America's enablement of this. And it really brought out in the open conversations that have been occurring behind the scenes and at the grassroots level on the floors of Congress in a way that it just has never been seen before. And since then, it's obviously captured national attention, and there's been an ongoing debate among senior members of the party, both officials and lawmakers, of how to combat this and show that the party's not actually divided, that, the vast majority of the party is on the same page, and that these are just two extreme wings that don't really capture where the party is. And I think that also goes back to what Allison and Danny were saying, where the Israel debate has largely been turned into a wedge issue, and it's largely been turned into a partisan tool. And a lot of that is because of Republicans, a lot of that is because of Democrats reacting to Republicans, a lot of that is because of Netanyahu. There's just so many things that make this a perfect storm where the issue is becoming a wedge issue. And so what's going on with senior members of the party is that they are really much focusing on how to, to put it a little pejoratively, how to win the battle of hearts and minds, and to really capture the narrative and to show that, Israel remains a bipartisan issue. Democrats support Israel just as much as Republicans do. We just don't believe in giving Israel a blank check to pursue policies that are antithetical to our party's values.
Yeah, and we'll see how the debate continues to, form and kind of cause tensions in the party ahead of the midterms in 2022. Ellison, turning to you and a bit back to the discussion over here in Israel, how is all of this reflected in the discourse in Israel? Is there a sense that the people get the nuance, the differences between different wings of the party, the issue of Biden and Congress not being always on the same page? How is this reflected in the Israeli dialogue?
Well, not to be too snarky about it, but Israelis are having enough trouble these days trying to figure out how their government is working. And very few, only I think those who do it for a living have the bandwidth to try to analyze, the party dynamics inside Washington. And again, because Israel has a parliamentary system in which what happens with the prime minister is so closely tied and intertwined to what's happening in the Knesset, I think the average Israeli doesn't quite have a grasp on the fact that what the White House is doing doesn't always exactly reflect what's happening in Congress. So I think they see how the Biden White House has behaved, and they feel like, yeah, everything's, under control. Look, Biden hasn't hit us too hard, and I think that we're happy, I guess, with the tone coming out of the White House. And when it comes to the Congress, I also think, again, as a hangover of the Netanyahu Biden years, they're already a little bit inured to what's coming out of the Squad and AOC. In a simplistic way, the Republicans support us and the Democrats don't like us. So I don't think yet the Israeli public really understands what's being described here, what Ben's talking about in terms of a change in the mainstream Democratic supporters of Israel, maybe changing their tone and being harsher critics, while it's definitely being perceived on the Danny Diane levels of experts and of government officials whose job it is to follow these things. I don't think it's quite filtered down to the general Israeli public yet, who, as I said, is a little bit overwhelmed by their own domestic events.
Yeah, it's I'm reminded by your comment, Alison. I was in the U.S. when Trump was elected president, and I had a lecture that was pre-scheduled a year before with Dan Kurtzer, who was teaching one of the universities. And on the morning after Trump won, I called him and I said, Ambassador Kurtzer, we're canceling, right? I mean, nobody's going to come to listen to a lecture about Israeli politics. And he said, no. The students need to hear about other people's problems today. Danny, you wrote a really interesting article for us, I think it was 2 weeks ago, about Ron Dermer, who was ambassador in Washington when you were in New York, and the Dermer-Netanyahu approach to the American Jewish community, which you described as dangerous. And this connects, obviously, to the issue we're talking about today, in the sense that, the Jewish vote in America is overwhelmingly democratic, and you describe the attempts by Dermer and Netanyahu to align more with the evangelical Christians and the Republican Party. What is dangerous about that approach? What made you write that warning article?
Because it's not, I refused, I always refused, and I still refuse. I assume I will forever refuse to see the relationship between the state of Israel and American Jewry or diaspora Jewry, world Jewry, as a commercial transaction. You give us political support and money, and we give you, I don't know, pride or something, a nice attitude towards you. I think that to see that way is a moral failure. And when Ron Dermer made that evaluation of who supports Israel more in more issues, war unequivocally, I think that for me that was, as I said, a moral confusion, because our relationship with American Jewry transcends political issues and transcends the issue of political support or monetary donations. And if the ambassador of Israel to the United States didn't see it that way, that is dangerous for the, not only, it's dangerous for the raison d'etre of Israel's existence. I'm not saying that Israel exists only to have good relations with the world Jewry, but definitely it's one of the pillars of the reasons we established the Jewish state. Otherwise, we are simply an Israeli state that has allies in America. I am puzzled, by the way, not only by Ambassador Dermer or Prime Minister Netanyahu's attitude towards a world Jewry. I have serious criticisms of the Israeli society in its entirety on this issue. I think that sometimes that the attitude of the Israeli public opinion on the relations between Israel and our brothers and sisters overseas is more or less, and it's exaggerating a bit, but not too much, like our interest in the Hungarian minority in Romania. Not much more than that, unless Pittsburgh happens, and then all the television channels send their best reporters to report about that. But that's not the way we should maintain that relationship. And it's difficult. I am aware that it's difficult to maintain that relation. We are different. We have different characteristics, different. We see Jewish values differently in some senses, but it's an effort that we must make. Otherwise, the danger that in the Jewish history book that will be written, let's say 100 years from now, at the beginning of the 22nd century, we may read that during the 21st century, the Jewish people split it into two unconnected tribes. And I believe, A, that will be a tragedy. B, we are the patriarch now of the family, the Jewish state. So it's mainly our responsibility to prevent that from happening.
But Danny, isn't this connection of American Jewry that you think is so important? It's a little bit of a double-edged sword in Israel's case right now, because while I think the trend among most younger Americans might be more too detached from the Middle East, detached from Israel as it's detaching from much of the Middle East, and say, what does that have to do with us? A lot of the driving force and the criticism of Israel, and Ben has written about young Jewish staffers on Capitol Hill. A lot of that pushback, a lot of that pressure on Israel in terms of Palestinian rights is coming from younger Jewish circles who want their Jewishness and who want the Jewish state's policies to reflect the values that they believe are Jewish values.
Alison, I don't think that criticism of Israel doesn't bother me. What bothers me is disconnection from Israel, and the question is what precedes what. What did precede one or the other? Did Israel's indifference towards American Jews precede it, or the other way around? But the question is not to make a research, an historical research, how we got to this situation. The question is how we repair it. And I believe that is imperative for Israel to take serious initiatives in order to repair the relationship, mutually respecting, and this is important, mutually respecting the differences that we have, including in policy issues. And that, for me, is vital for the future of the Jewish people.
Ben, I want to turn to you, and we had this discussion about, and we heard from Danny and from Ellison about what a new government in Israel could mean for the relationship. When you talk to members of Congress, to their staff members, to people who are doing advocacy on these issues, do you feel that the history of Netanyahu, the baggage that Danny mentioned, and we're not talking about the story in the Washington Post about bringing laundry to the White House, we're talking about the history of the political angle. Do you think that is the main issue, or are there more ideological issues that have to do with Israel's policies, with the settlements, occupation, the Palestinian issue, and that those will remain and still cause this rift on the day after?
So those ideological issues are definitely going to remain, excuse me, but I don't think you can underestimate the level of Bibi fatigue that exists in the city right now.
Bibi fatigue.
Bibi fatigue. I mean,
we have more in Israel.
But what does it look like in Washington?
So what it looks like is that, when I have conversations with people and I ask them, are you worried about Bennett's support of annexation and of settlements? And are you worried that the government is going to be paralyzed on the Israeli-Palestinian front, or that they may continue Netanyahu's open campaign against the Iran deal? Honestly, the biggest answer I get is we don't care. We're just tired of Bibi. And that anything else, the day after, we'll deal with it then. But as soon as Bibi gets out of there, we can still start rebuilding something better and something a little bit more bipartisan in the way that it's traditionally been, rather than having Israeli policy so closely associated with a cult of personality.
And do you see on this issue, Ben, a difference between the more progressives and, let's say, the pro-Israel but becoming more critical wings of the party, specifically on the Netanyahu part of the divide here?
I mean, I definitely think there's more optimism with that sort of silent majority that I mentioned earlier in terms of, okay, we can work with this, you know, a party with Merav Michaeli as a minister is going, or a government with Merav Michaeli as a minister is going to be a lot easier to work with than a government with Itamar Ben-Gvir as a minister. So I think there's a little bit of optimism in that sense. But I think when it comes to this progressive wing, the point that they've really been hammering home over the past, you know, several weeks, in the past several months, is that what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the streets of Israel is not limited to the past 3 weeks. And occupation is over 50 years old. They're talking about roots of systematic oppression going back to 1948. These are not issues that will be changed overnight with just a new government that has a lot of right-wing elements that they find deeply and morally offensive. So hold on to your optimism, I would say.
Yeah, what you're saying, Ben, is I'm gonna still, you know, get some good stories from you about this issue, even if we get a new government here in Israel.
We're not going to be in Kumbaya anytime soon.
Yeah, looking forward to reading. Ellison, you want to say something?
Yeah, if I can just jump in for a minute, you know, the Capitol Hill has, as I said before, has not gotten to know Naftali Bennett. And I think that there might be some surprises in store in that, you know, realizing that he may not be Netanyahu, but he's definitely more right-wing than Netanyahu. Netanyahu hedged and went back and forth, right, on whether he supported a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. Naftali Bennett is forthright in the fact that he opposes a Palestinian state and that he opposes a two-state solution. What's going to be really fascinating, presuming this government coalition is actually created, is the plan to have Yair Lapid be the foreign minister while Naftali Bennett is the prime minister. They are probably going to have to draft a script when it comes to how to present themselves internationally, because it's going to be Lapid who implicitly, if not explicitly, wants two states and a two-state solution, having to voice the policy and represent a government headed by a prime minister who vocally, historically, and consistently has opposed one.
Mm-hmm.
I hope the attitude of Bennett as prime minister, if he becomes prime minister, will be different from Netanyahu's in that respect, that I assume he will not have that, you know, in-your-face attitude that Netanyahu had. And, you know, if I can testify from my personal experience, it is possible. I would say it this way: it's the ability to present Israeli policies in a progressive vocabulary sometimes makes wonders. And I think that he's able to do that. For sure, Lapid as foreign minister will be able to do that. I think it's possible. Now, two additional remarks. First of all, even the progressives are not, you know, an homogeneous bloc. We have what the progressive call, I don't like that term, but the PEP, progressive except for Palestine, progressives that are pro-Israel or are less critical of Israel. I think the most shining example is also from New York, member of Congress, Richie Torres, from the Bronx, that is a staunch progressive and even stauncher supporter of Israel, but there are others, including, I would say, Mayor de Blasio. But also in Congress, there are others. The second thing that I must say, you know, self-flagellation is all right, but let's don't forget that nothing is bipartisan anymore in America. Everything is partisan. Abortion is partisan. Gun control is partisan. Tax cuts are partisan. Even the masks for COVID.
Election results are partisan.
COVID-19 masks and vaccines are partisan. And I used to joke that even the weather became partisan after the, you know, this debate about global warming or not. If it's too cold for you in Fox News, go to CNN, it will be warmer because they believe in global warming, and Fox doesn't. But under those circumstances, when everything is partisan, to maintain Israel to the extent that we succeed to maintain Israel as practically the only bipartisan issue. Even in foreign policy, NATO became a partisan issue, and others. That is challenging, objectively challenging. And I think that under those circumstances in which everything is partisan in the American society these days, the level of bipartisan support that we maintain is somewhat of an achievement.
It is one of the last issues where you can still get a very large majority in Congress to support. Although I do have to say,
probably opposition to China is the other one.
Probably, and I do have to say though, when you do follow the stories that Ben has been filing for us, you see that the numbers are shifting a little bit. It's still, Israel has the clear majority, but I understand why there is the concern that exists among the professional ranks in Israel. Ben, you want to say something about that?
I just want to give one example. So after everything happened, between the events in Sheikh Jarrah and when the military operation in Gaza started, there was an unprecedentedly harsh letter written by two Democrats. One of them has been in Congress for about 10 years. One of them is a first-term congresswoman who primaried a Democrat, actually, to Danny's earlier point. And this letter was unprecedentedly harsh. It accused Israel of violating international law and basic human rights norms, and it called on Tony Blinken to investigate whether or not Israel was in fact violating US law based on housing demolitions in the West Bank. And this letter, the text of it itself was remarkable. And the fact that it actually got sent to Blinken was remarkable. And they were probably expecting 5, 6, 7 signatures on it. It ended up getting 25 signatures. So it cannot be overestimated how real this conversation is and how much it's moving in real time.
There's also, it was very interesting, I believe it was Max Boot writing in the Washington Post who made a point that I hadn't considered before. And it was saying, everyone's over-focused on the Democrats, how, the Democrats are becoming so extreme, knee-jerk Palestinian rights and anti-Israel, et cetera. And nobody talks about the other side, how we used to have a fairly critical Reagan administration when Reagan was in the White House, how we had a very tough Bush #1 administration when it came to Israel, and that the mirror image of what's happening in the Democratic Party is that the Trump influence on the Republican Party is that it's become almost doctrinaire to be, as reflexively pro-Israel or Israel is right, as it's becoming increasingly, though not to such an extreme on the Democratic side, to criticize Israel, that Israel is wrong.
Yeah, the first president to, I think, officially say that it's an American objective to have a Palestinian state was George W. Bush in the roadmap. And you compare that to, I don't think today you could get 5 Republican members of Congress to say on the record there needs to be a Palestinian state.
Right. So that that speaks to Danny's point about everything becoming increasingly partisan, and it's interesting to see how supporting Israel no matter what has become more of an orthodoxy on the Republican side than it was previously.
And that's something that Democrats are increasingly concerned about, by the way. They are really, to Donnie's point where he said, everything is partisan these days, Democrats, and very traditionally pro-Israel Democrats are very concerned about the game that Republicans are playing with this. And they find that it puts them in a very difficult position. And it finds that, to Danny's earlier point, that it makes them vulnerable down the line.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is we will see how it plays out more in the coming election. We have in America, the midterms in a year, just under a year and a half. Guys, we have so many questions from the audience that were sent to us via the chat. So I will start going over them now. I apologize, we're not going to get to every question because we really did have quite an influx of good questions from people this time. So one question that I want to start with, and I want to have you address it, Ben. There is this, we're talking about the difference between, the Biden wing and the younger, AOC affiliated. And we have, I think, even more than one question basically saying, but, Biden is the old guard. Biden is on the way out. And then, shouldn't Israel be more concerned about the trend among the younger elected officials?
I think Israel should absolutely be concerned. I think that, people of my generation, they very much came of age under viewing Netanyahu's Israel. And they've seen Gaza under blockade. They've seen continuing creeping annexation. They've seen countless military operations. And it really violates what millennials value in terms of human rights and in terms of politics and in terms of intersectionality and things like that. And, millennials are now at the point where they are entering positions of influence, and they are getting staffing jobs on Capitol Hill, and they are running for office, and they're becoming communications directors and legislative directors, and really starting to not only bring these values to the front, but also really reckoning with what they were taught about Israel growing up. And I think this is also something that we haven't talked about yet. It's almost an indictment on the US Jewish establishment and the US Jewish community that they were taught this mythic image of Israel, that Israel can do no wrong, that it's the most moral army and all of the cliches and everything. And there's usually one event, whether it's a war or whether it's some sort of, Sheshara, for example, that really makes them start to reckon with all of this. And it sort of creates a journey that all of these millennials go on. And now that they are entering positions of influence and positions of power with all of this context and moving forward, they are really bringing it to bear. And it's really going to have an effect on policy moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. I just have to step in as a person of the generation before Ben, that it's not completely new under the sun. When you look at some of the people in high-ranking positions in the Biden White House, at the Anthony Blinkens and the Jake Sullivans, who are sort of my cohort, they grew up watching Israel and Lebanon. So it's not like, we're not talking about a changing of the guard from the 6-day war generation. So I think that what Ben's observing is correct, but I think it's a process that's been happening for quite a while in terms of grappling between wanting Jewish American young people to have a connection and feel that importance of a shared Jewish faith in the Jewish state, versus watching it on television screens on the evening news and seeing that it doesn't necessarily embody the values that you're being taught in Sunday school.
That's
Right.
totally fair, but at the same time, a 30-year-old doesn't remember Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister. A 30-year-old doesn't remember.
That's true. It doesn't remember Oslo.
Left-wing government. I know how much Danny doesn't like left-wing, right-wing, but a 30-year-old doesn't remember a left-wing government in Israel. So
I must say, first of all, I don't buy I heard many times that argument that Israel was presented in Camp Ramah and other places as almost a utopian place without faults, etc. With all due respect, and I don't buy that narrative. Youngsters read newspapers and read the New York Times and the Washington Post. They know a lot about Israel. I don't think that anyone was, cheated or things like that about what Israel is at the end isn't. But I must say now, after I castigated the Israeli society about and the Israeli leadership about its relationship towards its attitude towards American Jews and world Jews in general, I must say now a word about the American young Jews, the younger generation.
But Danny, short, because we have other amazing questions.
The remark is if the American Jewish community believes that it will be able to disconnect from Israel sentimentally, because this reason or that reason, it doesn't matter, and still remain a vibrant Jewish community for the decades to come, well, I think they are being overly optimistic if they believe that.
Interesting. Okay, guys, we have great questions. So this is an amazing discussion, but I have to move on because we did give a promise and we want to try to keep our promises. Ellison, a question I want to refer to you. What do you think a President Joe Biden could do to maybe encourage a change of policy in Israel that would, align more with his priorities?
what he could do. Well, I mean, he's starting to do what I think he needed to do. And if the goal is to bring the parties to the table and to encourage
the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Israelis and the Palestinians and encourage negotiations, I think it's got to be, it's got to be on both sides. And I think, he's starting to work the Palestinian side by re-engaging with the Palestinians, by reopening the consulate that's going to deal with the Palestinian leadership in East Jerusalem. I think that, Biden and his administration, first of all, I think from everything we've seen, this is not a problem that they are particularly interested in putting as a #1 priority of solving right now. So I will make my answer to the question in the context of that. I don't think it's something that they want to do now. They've got, after COVID and vaccination and the infrastructure bill, Biden knows that he's not going to be judged, that the Democrats in the midterms and that whoever runs for election of president next is not going to be judged in terms of what their Middle East policy is. But I think that he's going to do, if he does something in terms of re-engagement, of trying to bring the parties to the table and talk to each other. First of all, to undo some of the damage that was done during the Trump administration, in which there was a complete disengagement between the U.S. administration and the Palestinian side. And it doesn't seem very much like Joe Biden to decide that he's going to accomplish anything by pressuring Israel harder, by threatening to withhold military aid, as some of the progressive wing wants it to do. So I think what he can do the most is try to bring the two sides together, once more in either a mediated dialogue or get them to talk directly one to the other.
Although I will say, we not on this panel today, but we did have an article last week by Alon Pinkas, who basically told Biden, don't touch the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you will only lose from it. So
that's why I was qualifying my answer.
Yeah. So if you want, that perspective is an interesting article to read. Another question that I want to refer to you, Danny. If there is this new government, what would it mean for issues that are of importance to a lot of American Jews, that have to do with Jewish pluralism in Israel and more religious freedom? Where would that come into play, in your opinion?
It's difficult to know, because this is a creature that we never experienced anything like it, a government so diverse in its positions. So I understand that since the two sides of the equation have mutual vetoes, most probably nothing dramatic will happen. I hope that nevertheless the issue of the kotel can be resolved in a way that will respect the rights of the liberal denominations in Judaism. For sure, I'm a big supporter of that, as you know. On the issue of conversion of Giur is very interesting, because if there is mutual veto and nothing happens, so the recent ruling by the Supreme Court is the prevalent situation, and that is a big win for liberal Jewish denominations.
I think it's going to be interesting if this government in formation remains the way it is without the ultra-Orthodox parties, or if the ultra-Orthodox make the decision to try to come into the government. I think that if they remain outside, then there is going to be some wiggle room and some way to move things, perhaps in the directions of accommodating the desires of non-Orthodox American Jews.
I think that there is a chance. I don't want to be too optimistic, but there is a chance that in this during this government we'll be able to solve what I see as the most pressing issue on that category, and that is some form of civil marriage in Israel.
Yeah, I hear your party is being pretty tough on these issues, Danny. Danny, your party is reportedly being quite tough on those issues, on the religion state issues, no?
Actually not. The party I joined, and I hope I have some influence in that, not only that advocated for some kind of civil marriage, also for marriage equality for gay people.
Yeah.
I think the main issue again, like you both said, and Ellison, that's a very smart comment. Will the ultra-Orthodox jump in, and if not, then there will be an opening. Ben, I want to take this to a different direction, and we have a question. With all the baggage and all the history that we know about Netanyahu and the Democrats and working with the Republicans, there is a personal history and some kind of relationship with Biden. And there is a question, what would a new prime minister need to do to establish something with President Biden?
So obviously there's not going to be that muscle memory that comes with decades of experience. And, Biden and Netanyahu obviously have a certain shorthand. And I think it's safe to say that the administration credits that shorthand to keeping the Gaza operation within 11 days and keeping the casualty count lower than it's been compared to past operations. So traditionally speaking, when there's a new prime minister that comes into office, the US president is able to push them toward making some concession or some steps toward negotiations or final status talks. Obviously, that's not on the Biden administration's agenda right now, but I think, whether it's Iran, whether it's, halting settlement expansion, whatever that minimal sort of specific policy step will be, I think it's safe to say that Biden will be able to exert his influence on a first-term new prime minister who doesn't have the experience of leading a country, but also that doesn't have that shorthand with Biden.
And I think, Danny, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that at least Gideon Saar said that on the issue of annexation, he wants to respect the promise that Netanyahu gave to President Trump not to commit annexation because of the Abraham Accords, right? Because of the agreement with the UAE and Bahrain.
We at least were very clear during the electoral campaign that any new government must respect international commitments made by its predecessors. And that includes the very clear commitment by Prime Minister Netanyahu to President Biden, to the UAE, to Bahrain, and others not to make any kind of annexation in the coming years. Yeah. So I don't expect anything to happen on that front.
Yeah, I would also be shocked. Ellison, a question to you that actually has to do with the coalition bargaining in Israel. This is something that a lot of our viewers are interested in. There is a question, after all the talk we've had in the 2 months since the election, is the Islamist Ra'am party, the United Arab Party, eventually going to join this new coalition if it is formed or not? Where is that going to fall?
Well, Mansour Abbas says, anyone who will give his community what it needs in terms of resources, in terms of, I presume, maybe a ministerial position for him, will get their support. So, it's going to be, let's make a deal. Presumably, this group will be eager enough to want him to join, that they'll offer him what he wants. There's a few rumors actually in the last hour or so that perhaps one of his party members is not going to support it. There's, this is all going to be floating around as to who's going to support what. But if I were betting, I would lay my bets on that he's going to name his price, and the Change Coalition, as it's called, is going to offer it to him because they really need him.
Ellison, I remember that before the election, you went to Mansour Abbas's village. Right. Mansour Abbas is the leader of the United Arab Party, and could become now the kingmaker, and to kind of seal the deal for the coalition. And I remember the headline we gave your report from Mrar, from his community in the north. It was, this Arab-Israeli leader could decide if there will be a 5th election. Yeah. And that was in March before the election. Still holds true today, 2 months
now,
later.
If he could decide if there's going to be a non-Netanyahu coalition. When I asked people in the town about him, what do you think of Mansour Abbas? They said, he's a great dentist.
Okay. Well, we'll see if with that also comes the great the political maneuvering ability. So far, he's played it very, very smart. Another question that I want to refer to you, Ben. We are getting several. I'm going to try to merge several questions from people about the issue of young American Jews and the distance from Israel. And do you see that also in the professional circles that you cover in Washington, D.C.?
I do. I mean, listen, I don't want to cast too much of a generalization on it. I mean, listen, the debate like the American Jewish community, contains multitudes, and it's very important not to cast mass generalizations, but I think there is this past military operation in particular, compared to past ones, there is just such a general, almost fatigue of trying to come up with explanations defending Israel and defending Israel's tact and behavior and the continuation of the occupation and Israeli policies. And it's something that Jews, Jewish journalists in general, American Jews of my generation, they are really sort of having conversations in a way that these conversations have not been occurring in the past.
Guys, we are basically past time, but we will take just one or two more quick questions. And I really want to thank everyone who has been with us so far. We have a great crowd, and thank you for sticking with us. Danny, we have a question that I want you to try to address shortly, because this is an important issue for you. And someone is writing us, basically the elephant in the room at the end of the day is the issue of the settlements and their expansion. If this is not dealt with, this crisis is not going to be solved.
Well, the question is, I mean, it's I don't think this is the right forum, and we don't have time to detail the whole settlements issue. So I refer to that in the prism of our relationship with the Biden administration. No doubt that, first of all, in this government, as we said, there will be a mutual veto. I don't foresee a huge expansion of building in Judea and Samaria. But I think the litmus test for both us and the Biden administration regarding how we are going to deal mutually with this issue is construction in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem.
And there's a history with Biden and that issue. Remember, his visit in 2010 in Israel.
At that time was the vice president, the loyal vice president of Barack Obama. So I don't think he's the same person that then visited there now. Barack Obama set the precedent actually, that construction in Jerusalem is something that is a trigger for a crisis. During the previous administrations, except for very
Har Choma, Clinton,
Givat Hamatos, construction in Jerusalem was a non-issue practically. And President Barack Obama made this huge strategic mistake, but making that a contentious issue. It actually was a blunder, because it completely ruined the peace negotiations he was trying to conduct. The Palestinians couldn't be less exigent, have less demands than the President of the United States. I think the litmus test, the most interesting point is to see how the Biden administration will deal with construction in the Jewish neighborhoods in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem. My guess, he will adopt something very similar to the Bill Clinton policy of not making a big issue of that, if at all, and not the attitude of the president he loyally served for 8 years.
And if that happens, we'll get some interesting stories from Ben about the reactions to that in Congress. One last question, and Ellison, I want you to take on that. Do you think a new government with the Biden administration could work to expand what we call the Abraham Accords, these normalization agreements that we've seen with the Gulf? We have one question specifically about Saudi Arabia, maybe. Do you think that momentum could continue with the current administration and a different government in Israel?
I think it could continue. I mean, everything's possible, right? But I really think that it's going to all rest on what happens on the issue of Iran. Because I think that, the Abraham Accords to a really large extent were born out of the alignment of the Gulf nations with Israel and with the support of the Trump administration of taking a hard line on Iran. And the Biden administration is obviously not pointed in that direction. So we're going to see, I think that the Abraham Accords now at this point have a momentum of their own in terms of the relationship between the Gulf states and Israel being out in the open. So, I think that the existing Abraham Accord relationships are going to flourish no matter what happens in the White House as to whether they will expand to other countries, namely Saudi Arabia. I think to a large extent will depend on how the Iran issue plays out, how aggressively the Biden White House works to get back into the JCPOA, whether that happens, how Israel reacts, and how the Gulf states react to. So I think that's a whole big dynamic that has yet to be seen, because even though Iran is a big issue on the Biden White House agenda, it really hasn't emerged yet as a headline issue.
And that's interesting. And I think it's also interesting to note that it was reported that one of the considerations that led Biden to push for a ceasefire around the fight in Gaza was also these accords, and keeping these strong relationships between Israel and the Gulf, and not letting the crisis spill into something more regional.
And I think it was a motivating force on the Israeli side too, because the Iran issue was a priority, and it didn't want to anger the United States so much on Gaza that it risked having whatever influence that it would have on Iran.
Yep, that's always trying to balance these issues. Friends, we are really past the hour, so I want to first of all thank all of you.
If I may, one remark, Amir.
Very short.
I see a comment by Maura Resnick. I hope she's still with us on an issue that I'm very passionate about. And she follows up in something I said, and she writes that young American Jews have plenty of ways to express Jewish values without any connection to Israel. And that is a fact. I don't disagree with that. I only think that in the long term, that is unsustainable.
Okay, well, maybe we should do a different session at some point about specifically this issue. I think all of you guys will have a lot to say about it. I want to thank everybody who watched us today with a great card, and to encourage everyone to subscribe to Haaretz.com, to sign up to our newsletters so you could get all of Ben's scoops and all of Elison's great stories and Danny's interesting articles, and to get writer alerts for Ben and Elison and Danny. And of course, to join us soon when we'll do our next Zoom. Maybe by then we'll have a new government in Israel, who knows? And of course, maybe. And of course, thank you to Danny and Ben and Elison for this wonderful discussion today. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you soon. Goodbye.